You cleaned the feeder last week. You rinsed it, maybe scrubbed it, refilled it, and hung it back up, feeling like you had done something good for the birds. You probably used the same thing you use on everything else in the kitchen. Dish soap, a bleach solution, maybe a vinegar spray you keep under the sink because someone told you it was natural. The feeder looked clean. The birds came back. Nothing seemed wrong, but something was wrong, and the birds could not tell you. What happens inside a bird's body when a feeder is cleaned with the wrong agent, and what that means for every bird that visits your yard, is more specific and more serious than most people who feed birds have ever been told. This script is going to explain exactly what those agents do, why birds cannot avoid them even when the residue is invisible, and what the one cleaning method is that the research actually supports. We are going to end with something that will make you look at your feeder differently every time you take it down. Stay with this. Welcome back to the Bird's Lore. This episode is about feeder hygiene, not as a chore, but as a biological event that either protects the birds coming to your yard or quietly harms them. If you want to understand what your feeder is actually doing to the birds that depend on it, subscribe now, because what we are going to cover in the next few minutes is not what most birding guides tell you, and the difference matters. The thing most people reach for first is dish soap. It is in every kitchen. It cuts grease, it smells clean, it rinses clear, and the label says nothing about birds. That last part is the problem. Dish soap is a surfactant, a compound engineered to disrupt the surface tension between oils and water so that grease lifts away from surfaces. That is exactly what it does to a bird. The preening oils that coat every feather on every bird that visits your yard are the product of the uropygial gland, a small structure at the base of the tail that secretes a complex lipid compound the bird spreads across its plumage during preening. Those oils are not cosmetic. They are the waterproofing, the insulation, the parasite barrier, and the structural integrity of every feather. When a bird feeds from a feeder that carries surfactant residue, even a feeder that has been rinsed until it looks clean, that residue transfers to the bill transfers it to the preening sequence, and the preening sequence distributes it across the feathers. The surfactant does not need to be present in large amounts to do damage. It does the same thing to feather oils that it does to kitchen grease. It dissolves them. The damage is not immediate and visible. It is gradual, cumulative, and invisible until the bird is already compromised. Research into surfactant exposure in wild passerines, conducted in part through toxicological studies, published in connection with the Journal of Animal Behavior, and through wildlife rehabilitation data, compiled at institutions including Cornell Lab of Ornithology, has documented that sublethal surfactant exposure in small birds results in degraded waterproofing, increased thermoregulatory cost, and elevated susceptibility to feather lice and mites, whose populations are normally held in check, partly by those same preening oils. A chickadee that visits a soap residue feeder every morning through February is not dying at your feeder. It is arriving at every cold night of that month, with feathers that hold heat slightly less efficiently than they should. The margin in a small bird's thermal budget is not large. The chickadee that does not make it to March may have had many factors working against it. Your feeder may have been one of them. Bleach is the other common choice, and the reasoning behind it is sound. Bleach kills Salmonella, Aspergillus, and the suite of pathogens that accumulate in wet seed hulls and bird droppings. It is genuinely effective against the organisms that make feeders dangerous. The problem is not what bleach kills. The problem is what bleach leaves behind when the rinsing is incomplete, which is most of the time, because the concentration required to kill Aspergillus spores is high enough that complete removal of residue from the interior surfaces of a typical tube feeder requires more flushing than most people perform. Sodium hypochlorite, the active compound in household bleach, is a strong oxidizing agent. In birds, oxidizer exposure at the mucosal surfaces of the bill and upper digestive tract causes tissue irritation that compromises the bird's ability to process food efficiently and, at higher concentrations, produces lesions. The American goldfinch and the house finch are among the species most frequently presenting at wildlife rehabilitation centers with upper digestive tract damage that correlates with feeder use. The causal chain is difficult to establish with certainty in wild birds, but the correlation is consistent enough that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Project Feeder Watch explicitly warns against bleach concentrations above a 9-to-1 water-to-bleach ratio and against any cleaning method that does not include extended rinsing under running water. Vinegar is the choice that arrives with a health halo, and the halo is partly deserved. Acetic acid is genuinely antifungal at concentrations above 5%, which is the concentration in standard white distilled vinegar. It is not as broadly antimicrobial as bleach. It will not reliably neutralize salmonella, but it also does not carry the residue risks of surfactants or the oxidizer risks of hypochlorite. And for a feeder that is cleaned frequently enough that pathogen loads are low before cleaning begins, it does the job it needs to do. The limitation is not toxicity. The limitation is that vinegar is selectively effective, and using it as a substitute for bleach in a feeder that has not been cleaned in 3 weeks is choosing a tool that is not matched to the problem. The Cornell Lab's guidelines draw a useful distinction here. The cleaning agent is not the whole protocol. The scrubbing, physical removal of seed debris, hull residue, and droppings is what reduces pathogen load before the disinfecting agent does its work. A feeder cleaned thoroughly with a stiff brush and hot water, and then rinsed with a vinegar solution and air-dried is meaningfully safer than a feeder quickly soaked in bleach and rehung wet. The sequence matters as much as the chemistry. What the research actually supports is a protocol built around 1 part unscented household bleach to 9 parts water, a minimum contact time of 60 seconds on all interior surfaces, and a rinse sequence long enough that no chlorine odor remains, a detail that matters because birds' olfactory sensitivity to volatile compounds, including chlorine, is well documented, and a feeder that still smells of bleach to you almost certainly registers at a higher intensity to the birds approaching it. After rinsing, air drying is not optional. It is the step that most changes the outcome. A feeder rehung while still damp provides the exact moisture environment that Aspergillus and Salmonella require to re-establish within hours. The University of Exeter's work on salmonellosis transmission in garden bird populations, specifically the epidemics that have periodically swept through greenfinch and chaffinch populations in the United Kingdom, consistently points to wet feeder surfaces as the primary amplification site for the pathogen. Dry feeders do not eliminate disease risk. They substantially reduce the rate at which that risk compounds. The ruby-throated hummingbird adds a separate and more urgent chapter to this. Nectar feeders are not analogous to seed feeders. The sugar solution they hold is a growth medium, warm, simple carbon, exactly what mold and fermentation bacteria require. The standard recommendation from ornithological sources, including the Cornell Lab, is that nectar feeders be cleaned and refilled every 2 days in summer heat, every 4 to 5 days in cooler weather. The cleaning agent for nectar feeders is hot water and a bottle brush, not soap. Not bleach. The interior surfaces of a nectar feeder have contact with fluid. The bird ingests directly, not incidentally. Soap residue in a seed feeder is transferred through bill contact and preening. Soap residue in a nectar feeder is consumed. The distinction is not subtle. Every source that addresses hummingbird feeder hygiene specifically identifies dish soap as the agent to avoid, for the reason that its residue is nearly impossible to fully remove from the small ports and interior chambers of most nectar feeders, and that even trace surfactant concentrations alter gut motility in small birds. The hummingbird that visits a feeder cleaned with soap is getting a small dose of a compound that is doing exactly what it was designed to do, in a context where that function is catastrophic. The mourning dove that sits at the base of your platform feeder every morning is not visiting a neutral surface. Every feeder is a biological environment, a site of accumulated droppings, hull debris, moisture, and the organisms that feed on them, and what you use to clean it determines what that environment does to the birds inside it. The downy woodpecker working the suet cage is making a dozen bill contacts with that surface in a single visit. The American robin that occasionally picks seed off the ground beneath the feeder is in contact with whatever has fallen and whatever is living in what has fallen. You cannot see any of this. The birds cannot avoid it. They are using the resources you have provided because the resources are there, because the birds have assessed your yard and found it safe, because over time, the relationship between your yard and the birds that visit it has been built on something that looks a lot like trust, even if trust is not quite the right word for what a bird is doing when it returns to the same feeder every morning for 3 winters. What you use to clean that feeder is part of what your yard is, not the largest part, not even a part you would normally think of as connected to the biology of the birds themselves, but connected. The northern cardinal that has been coming to your feeder since October does not know what surfactants are. It does not know what you cleaned the feeder with last Sunday. It knows the feeder is here, and it comes, and what happens in its body after it comes depends on decisions you made at the kitchen sink. That is the whole of it. The feeder is not a passive object. It is an intervention in the lives of the birds that use it, and every cleaning is part of that intervention, and what you reach for under the sink is a choice that matters more than it looks like from where you are standing. You took the feeder down last week and cleaned it and hung it back up, and the birds came back. They came back because they had decided your yard was worth coming back to, because the seed was there, because nothing had yet driven them away. The black-capped chickadee that arrived within an hour of rehang had no way to measure what you left on the surface. The cardinal that came at dusk was working from the same incomplete information. They trusted the feeder the way they trust the branch, because it has held them before, and they have no reason yet to believe it will not hold them again. That trust is not something they give easily. It was built over time, one return visit at a time, against a landscape full of things that will harm them. You are responsible for it. The soap under your sink is not what they came back for.